Wow. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. We have a very special guest that is Nikolai Petro, a very important and prestigious voice who spent a lot of time trying to research the region that we are looking at, that is Russia and Ukraine. Professor, welcome to our show.
Nice to be with you, Mihail.
Nikolai, we've met for the first time in Washington, D.C., and we talked about, I think, the most important novel of the 19th century, that is Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. And I think it was a very difficult context in which we already discovered the early signs of the Russian aggression towards or against Ukraine. But now we are 3 years down the road almost, and we see an almost implacable advance of the Russian army now towards various regions. In particular, we are seeing the Russian armies basically challenging the Ukrainians and very close to basically finishing off the what is left from the Donbas region. How do you see the last advances of the Russian army as a very specific and targeted question? And how do you see the next 3 months or so? Because it's going to be very, very difficult indeed.
Yes, implacable is a good word to use to describe the current military scenario, the trajectory, I would say, because it seems that Russia is beginning to reap the fruits of the long-term preparation that it began already probably at the end of 2022, when the strategy shifted, I think by that time already 2022, early 2023, from seeking a rapid negotiation to saying, okay, if there's not going to be a negotiated settlement in the foreseeable future, as was proposed in the first Istanbul talks, then we are going to take 2 more regions. And as Putin has repeatedly said over time, the longer you delay, the longer Ukraine and its allies choose to delay an actual negotiated settlement, the heavier the penalty will be for Ukraine. And I suspect a lot of Westerners didn't want to believe that. Just it didn't fit into the mindset of what they wanted to accomplish and what they thought could be accomplished. They thought Ukraine could force a settlement on its own terms. But as time has progressed, the disparity, the inherent disparity between the forces has come into play. And I think that's what what many military analysts, and I'm not a military analyst, I'm more of a social and historical commentator. But from what I can tell, based on the military analysis, there seems to be a very large consensus now that the Ukrainian military is on the ropes. And that maybe the next 2 months, so from Trump's perspective, 50 days, from Putin's perspective, 60 days, somewhere in that time frame, some sort of clear outcome should become visible. If we are to take some hope from this tragedy, from this awful situation of brothers fighting each other, brother Slavs fighting each other, it is that in the absence of a willingness to come to terms, the 2 official positions that the 2 sides are coming to the negotiations with cannot be more opposed to each other. But the fact that a number of actors, including Russia, including the United States, and presumably under the pressure of the United States, Europe will probably come to a similar conclusion. They're looking at this 2-month time frame as having some sort of turning point, some sort of decisive significance. And the only thing that could be decisive, I think, in this context, if it were to initiate an actual negotiated solution, the beginning of serious negotiations toward a settlement. Because if the outcome after these 2 months is to simply go back to the Biden policy of providing as much military aid as needed for as long as needed, well, that's not really a turning point at all. That simply prolongs the current scenario without changing any of the basic parameters, which there was a very good article, I believe, in the Business New Europe journal that Ben Aris puts out on this disparity. And Le Monde, apparently, not long ago, a week or so ago, wrote that the casualties on the Ukrainian side are probably vastly underestimated. Their calculation would be 6-1. So if one compares what the Ukrainians are saying their losses are, compared to the way Le Monde approached it, was to take the number of new cemetery plots that were being constructed. The discrepancy there would be 6 times greater than is being acknowledged in terms of the actual fatalities on the Ukrainian side, not to mention the Russian side, which is probably equally distorted. But the additional factor that enters into the equation is that Ukraine's mobilization efforts are proceeding with great difficulty and with some very visible, and some would say, I can't confirm this, but some would say, increasing resistance to forced mobilization. At the very least, what we can say is the official number of new volunteers for this first 6 months in Ukraine has been 500 people. Now, on the other side, Russia is recruiting in the first 5 months 38,000. Now, these are contract and volunteers. So again, the disparity there is very great. And of course, this needs to be converted into prepared soldiers, transported to the front, utilized in whatever military scenario there is, and given weapons. So that all takes some time. But Russia has the advantage of being on this road for quite some time now, whereas Ukraine has the disadvantage of not having those resources left to extrapolate on its behalf. And I think that can only lead to one very pessimistic conclusion for Ukraine for this war.
So what makes you believe that Vladimir Putin having this advantage in tactical terms? We see Pokrovsk right now being circled around, surrounded, and basically penetrated by the Russian troops. What makes you believe that he will stop there? I mean, why would he stop? In fact, he can actually march on. Even he could contemplate coming close to Kyiv if there is no fortress or any visible barrier from Pokrovsk, Slavyansk, and other such cities to Kyiv. It could be a matter of months to go there.
2 factors, I think, and although they have the same reason. The reason is essentially the same, that I don't think Russia wants to occupy all of Ukraine, because the cost of moving further and further west is exponentially greater, for 2 reasons. One is the local population has a greater history of resistance to Russian imperialism in Western Ukraine and starting with central, but moving even more intensely as we move to the west. And so one could anticipate, as occurred, as we know, after World War II, skirmishes and what's called insurgency movements remaining in Western Ukraine that would be damaging to the ability of Russia to get back on a track of peaceful development, which I think Putin ultimately wants the country to be on, and what he has been pursuing historically until these events in Ukraine, I believe. Of course, the global context has changed, but I think, again, Putin is thinking about not so much what can be accomplished by further pursuing a military campaign, but the kind of world that he would like to see and the kind of role that he would like to see Russia play in that world after the war. I think he's already thinking about maneuvering Russia into a position where it will be, at the very least, an indispensable actor in a post-Ukrainian war situation.
Post-war Ukraine, in a post-war Ukraine situation.
Yeah, a post-war Ukraine, which I believe can be best described as the first phase of a decisive transition. This would mark the victory in Ukraine by Russia, would mark the first step in a decisive transition to a multipolar world. It would cement the collapse of Europe as the EU, I mean, specifically, the EU and NATO as decisive global actors. I think the United States, it would also signal the same thing, although the Americans, and I don't know whether you agree with me, but my sense, and the closer I get to Washington, where I now live, recently moved here, the more I get the sense that there is a remarkable capacity for self-delusion in Washington. Yes. The only thing we ever pay attention to is within the confines of the highway system around the capital, called the Beltway. And there's in the Beltway, that's the whole outside of the Beltway, very far away.
Well, I have to say that many things.
So I think but I think the writing's on the wall there as well.
So you said the two factors, one being the local resistance, and the second one,
right. And the other is the proximity of Europe, which I think has already indicated in its current elites, not to say that they will always be the elites in power, but there will always be a significant constituency in Europe for military confrontation and a resumption of the Cold War in the most confrontational terms possible, going back to the 1950s, brinksmanship, funding of insurgencies. This has more or less been going on through NGOs and all sorts of Western efforts that can at least be considered relatively benign. But that will all be much more militarized if Russia continues to push westward, increasing the costs for Russia. So I think what Putin and Russia and the Russian elite currently is looking for is a way out, but a way out that it has left itself because Putin has always said, these are my terms. There are only three things I demand. Give me those three things and Ukraine can essentially be left alone. That's how I read his three demands.
That is military neutrality, yeah?
Neutrality, denazification, which means reducing the visible impact of the far right in politics. Difficult to accomplish, but maybe not impossible. It's one of the more controversial aspects. And what's the third one? Oh, recognition of the territorial changes that have occurred. So the 5 oblasts, including Crimea, now it's part of Russia.
So you
But
feel
Putin has said,
yeah.
if you don't do this, we will continue to expand territorially. A difficult proposition, and I see in the foreseeable future, if they do continue to expand, for example, they're now going into Kharkiv region, little pockets, Dnepropetrovsk Oblast as well. And the situation there is still plausibly one of exchange of territories, okay? We leave Dnepropetrovsk, but you give us the last part of Donetsk, for example, Oblast. And you know, we even out the front lines.
So you're positive, though it sounds almost ironical, your optimistic scenario would be that Putin would stop with the 4 oblasts. He would not want to see the Russian flag being waved on a governmental building in Kiev. He would not want to humiliate Zelensky necessarily with that.
I don't think no. I hate to use a double negative. It's not that he doesn't want that. He might want that. He might consider that beneficial, but the cost of doing so, I think he would
be prohibitive.
To me, would be prohibitive. Whether he agrees with that, I'm not sure. And whether or not it becomes prohibitive, at least to go to the Dnieper, up to the Dnieper, would depend on whether or not the front line holds. In other words, my sense of the task facing both sides right now is if the major military units, the major military agglomerations there are surrounded and destroyed, then my understanding is the danger for Ukraine is that there are no fortifications and not many mobilizable troops between Pakrovsk, let's say, and Kramatorsk, and points westward, all the way up to Kyiv. But I don't know that. I'm not, there should be somebody with expertise in the military to say, but no, there's this fortification, there's that, or this could be moved around here and there.
Understood.
But the danger is that the absence of the ability to resist becomes a temptation to go as far as possible. But the good, again, from a negotiating standpoint, I think that's what we should all be hoping for, is the positive aspect for negotiation is that if you advance rapidly, but do not fortify, then you can retreat just as rapidly, because what you're doing is essentially indicating, don't force me to go there. I want to negotiate an exchange. But if you refuse the negotiation, I will reinforce this position. And that becomes a decision that Russia alone can make. And here's where I think Trump in particular, and Europe also, do not understand their impotence vis-a-vis what Russia can bring into play.
Do you think Mr. Putin is afraid of Donald Trump's ultimatum with the 50 days? Is there anything that can frighten Vladimir Putin right now when it comes to American threat or any kind of escalation?
No, I don't. And it's very strange to me that people take these threats seriously or pretend to, because we have had 17 or 18, I think it's 18 sanctions now, packets of sanctions. And correct me if I'm wrong, but each one was devastating.
Exactly.
Each one. And the first one was supposed to destroy Russia, and the second, and the third. Well, there's an old joke in English about the definition of insanity. doing the same thing time and time again and expecting a different result.
Sure.
It's hard for me to understand journalists who can write this sort of thing and forget what they've written 6 months ago when they wrote exactly the same thing and nothing happened. There seems to be no self-memory,
So Trump is doing just a PR exercise. Trump is doing just a PR exercise, trying to show the Europeans that he cares about Ukraine, he cares about Europe in general. But at the same time, he knows quite as a fact that this won't change the outcome of the conflict.
It's hard to imagine what goes on in the mind of such a mercurial personality. His calling card, his style, is one that capitalizes on his unpredictability. So he's the kind of negotiator. I don't know if this is good in business. I mean, he seems to have done quite well overall. But what he does is he comes in with ridiculous statements and things that seem outlandish to say in public. And then when you're behind closed doors, he's very nice, very congenial, wants to make a deal and all that sort of stuff. And then he comes out and claims credit for the deal that he just got, saying, well, it was exactly my strategy that accomplished this, when who knows what he gave away in the actual negotiation. And especially for diplomats, for seasoned, reasonable politicians, this kind of quick shift and sleight of hand, sort of like a card player, where they're moving the cups and you have to figure out where the ball is. That's the way he conducts government, and he conducts it that way domestically as well. And it puts all of his critics on the defensive, so that he's always claiming whatever it is that has been done, whether it's good or bad, whether he wanted it or not, he claims for it. And because he's the president, he's the source of the news, it gets reported that way first. And then everything else is not news, it's just commentary, which is then dismissed. Oh, well, those people, of course they'll say that, etc. So it's a very strange situation. And you have to sort of try to detach yourself from all of the showmanship, I would say, and try to figure out what is actually possible, given, as best you can determine it, reality. Where is the money? Where are the arms? Can any of these arms that are promised actually be delivered in a meaningful time frame or not? When the EU says, oh, we have given 2 billion or something or more, much more money, how is that money dispersed? How will it get there? What is it being used for? How much of it will it actually see? All of these questions are the actual questions that need to be answered to actually understand whether anything can change. And one of the things that it seems to me overall, looking at all the things that have been promised and all the threats that have been made, is that it seems to me overall that Europe and the United States, led now by the Trump administration, is trying to slow everything down. Everything that was in the pipeline to help Ukraine, because when a decision is made by the government for aid that would be coming, let's say now, it had to be made a year or more ago, because that's when the budget was taken. And then there's all sorts of authorizations and reauthorizations. And it's a very complicated procedure. Nothing moves very, very quickly, or can move very quickly, especially complicated military equipment, which is assembled in a variety of countries. You understand from NATO how difficult it is to even build one international fighter jet according to NATO standards, when the parts come from 6 different countries. And these parts have to be ordered, years in advance, which is why we don't have them. We just don't have this equipment ready. It's much easier to destroy such equipment, either when it arrives in Ukraine or en route as soon as it crosses the border, not to provoke an escalation. But it's much easier to destroy them than to produce them. And again, that is inevitably one of those aspects of war that favors the aggressor, in this case, Russia.
I should like to zoom out a bit because I'm in Bucharest, you are in Washington, D.C., and in 2008 we saw an impressive American delegation coming to Bucharest at the NATO summit. Of course, George W. Bush was there, Condoleezza Rice was there, and we had two important representatives of France and Germany respectively, and that is Nicolas Sarkozy and then, of course, Angela Merkel. And we had two very different philosophies, two very different attitudes towards NATO expansion. And one was conservative, and that's Angela Merkel's attitude. And she said very explicitly, do not invite Ukraine to become part of NATO. That was something that she said to Condoleezza Rice and also to Mr. Bush. But also you had Victoria Nuland and other people pushing for the expansion. Now, what happened in Europe, if you can answer this question, with the European elites, and especially with the leader of France and with the leader of Germany? Why did they change so much in terms of their opinion towards Ukraine? There's a dramatic shift from 2008 to today.
The two countries that I've spent several years growing up in, Germany and Italy. France, I hesitate to say a lot, but I can just give you my general impression that Macron seems to me to be a politician who is constantly seeking a grander status for himself than merely the president of France. He wants to be some sort of global figure, some sort of great intellectual, some sort of international leader, and he doesn't have the intellectual depth or consistency to carry that out. Many people think that consistency distracts or is a negative quality. But one of the things that it strikes me from some of our most highly successful authoritarian leaders over time is that, leaving aside the pros and cons of authoritarianism per se, the fact that they can pursue a policy over decades, and when they pursue it, they don't shift to appeal to this side, to appeal to that side. They lay out a strategic vision and seek to implement it over a long period of time. That gives them historical depth and what we call in the United States political gravitas, and Macron just doesn't have that. Merkel was popular. She led the country through difficult times and was able to build a very solid constituency within the Christian Democratic Party because of her East German roots. So while she could appeal to West Germans who were more pro-American, she had a sympathetic ear for the sensibilities of East Germans, many of whom have, I won't say fondness, but are far less afraid of the Russians than their Western counterparts in West Germany. And that divide, surprisingly, between the sensibilities, political sensibilities, and West Germans, you can see it in the latest election results. It continues to this day. So in Germany, you have constituencies that are, let's say, not necessarily pro-American, or not necessarily, even better, not necessarily anti-Russian. but see the possibility there of, or hope to return to the profitable relationships that they have. And that includes
cheap
the
energy,
minor left-wing parties. That includes a significant, or let's say an important faction of the SPD, which recently wrote a letter of about, I forget how many members of parliament, that signed on and said we need to think about the future and not simply about keeping Germany on a war footing for the indefinite future. And it includes the most popular party in Germany right now, which is the AfD, either number one or number two in the polls. Now, this is the far right and the far left. They should have nothing in common with each other, and they're not allowing themselves to talk about the possibility of a coalition, even a practical coalition. But if you look at their foreign policy positions, there is very little dividing them. And that leaves the current leadership of the Christian Democrats in a minority position. And for reasons that are hard for me to understand, even though I try to watch the German news and follow events there as much as I can. But I agree with a number of German commentators who look at the situation that the foreign policy that has been pursued, first by Olaf Scholz, but even more aggressively by Friedrich Merz, that it is not in Germany's interest. It seems to be focused on appeasing the interests of the United States, keeping a pro-American stance, which has been historically the strength of the Christian Democrats, but unfortunately at the expense of every other thing that post-war Germany has accomplished. Its economic strength, its social network, its domestic sovereignty. All of these seem to be sacrificed on the altar of leading Europe into some sort of new military crusade. And I'm not sure how viable that is. At least it seems to me that the strength of the left, the left parties, and the far right in particular, are reactions to these very policies. And if those policies continue in the same way, it will lead to a very dramatic shift in German politics, which will not, of course, necessarily follow from that Germany will change course, because as we've seen with the right-wing coalition, moderate right-wing coalition that we've seen in Italy, as soon as you come into power, it's all like, well, that was then, this is now, and all our international obligations require of us X, Y, and Z. But there are limits to everything, as Meloni has shown, as Pedro Sanchez has shown in Spain as well, not to mention Ireland, but more in the case of Gaza than in the case of Ukraine. Pro-peace factions are a significant constituency in many European countries, and express themselves come election time.
Well, there are many questions there. I was, again, very much intrigued by the wisdom of Angela Merkel, who prophesied, almost anticipated the situation we are right now in, while many other politicians in Europe could not quite figure out the tragic outcome of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, with the expansion of NATO as a kind of policy, which was the official policy of W. Bush in those days. Now, because you've mentioned America many times, and because you've spent so much time in the intellectual world, I should like to ask you, Professor, why do you think people like George Kennan in the 90s, even someone like Henry Kissinger, still in the 90s, were not taken seriously when they said, and this is Kennan in 1997, that the unilateral enlargement of NATO, not so much with the Czech Republic and Hungary or even Romania, but especially with Georgia and Ukraine, would spell disaster for the American foreign policy. Why do you think such a fine, such a nuanced, such an educated and erudite diplomat was not taken seriously by the Clinton administration and by the other politicians that followed?
Because the opportunity to put down a rival for the foreseeable future proved too great a temptation. So Kennan and Kissinger, in particular, appealed to the broader historical diplomatic context, which they knew. One of my favorite phrases from Henry Kissinger was the very succinct reminder. He said, "No great power retreats forever." There's always a comeback for a great power, because by great, we mean having the depth of resources to essentially always be able to come back. And therefore, we should anticipate that comeback in our strategy. But the elected politicians, and not so much the elected politicians, we can understand the narrowness of their time frame, but the people that they have around them, the people that they invite to be their advisors, are not typically, from what I've seen, advising them about the strategy to pursue so that 20 years from now, the United States or my country can be strong. It is, what can we get now that we can sell to the press as our victory right away? Now, it may seem that this is peculiar to the Trump administration. It's not. This is simply a hypertrophied and an exaggerated form of this kind of attitude toward political success. But it's always been the case in American politics, and to some extent is part of the nature of democracy, particularly kind of the modern democracy, where the sense of noblesse oblige is not really much valued. I remember reading in diplomatic history about George Atchison and sort of the people who at the outset of the Cold War, like Kennan himself, were trying to construct a vision of the world that would be self-replicating and would have an internal positive momentum that would attract more and more people to it. So it would survive on that basis alone. Even if one power receded compared to another power, the overall political momentum, the attraction of the ideas, the economic and security benefits of this kind of alliance, the Western alliance, would be increasingly obvious. Today, they're not so obvious. For many political analysts, they seem to be receding, these benefits. And so there's a sense of unease about what to do now. And there is the rise of some alternative, although this multipolar BRICS alternative and what it actually means has yet to be fleshed out. There's still a great deal of questions. But what's so fascinating is how many people, when you think about it over the last year and a half, how many countries have applied to join the BRICS from all over the world, the most diverse countries in their own types of development, compared to attitudes toward NATO and even the EU, where at least currently there doesn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm for joining, except for a few countries whose need to do so is actually clouded by the fact that what they think they're getting may not be what they will actually get in the EU, because few people in Ukraine think about the responsibilities and the costs that they will have to pay upon joining, and the constraints that this kind of alliance or membership, I should say, would impose upon them. This is all not very clearly thought through in Ukrainian political circles, I would say.
Someone like John Mearsheimer would tell you that BRICS is not going to be forever a united bloc. You have the tensions between India and China. But I will come back to, I should like to come back to the point you've made about NATO, because I'm a Romanian and because, of course, we have a very vivid memory of our experience with Russian aggression. It would be very hard for me not to say publicly that by joining NATO, at least for 20 years, we had a security umbrella which allowed Romania to flourish economically in a way which was not easy to anticipate in the 90s. And the same, of course, even more so would apply for Poland. Countries like Romania, Poland have benefited from this security umbrella. At the same time, I would be very candid with you. I'm a member of the of the Romanian Parliament. I'm a politician myself. If somebody would tell me that the price of my country joining NATO would be its utter destruction, I would not consider joining that military alliance.
The only thing I would add to that, to put my answer in context, is to remind people that the NATO and the EU of 1990 is not the NATO and EU of today. We have today a divided NATO, a divided EU, with more questions, I think, about its reliability than ever before. And a number of countries, I'd say on the off, at least 4 or 5, whose presidents have publicly declared that if the alliance were to go to war with Russia, please count us out. We don't want to participate in that. Exactly what that means, no one knows, because there are actually positive obligations that are expected of both EU members, as we've seen in the tortuous negotiations that for each packet of sanctions with respect to Slovakia and Hungary, and probably other nations that we don't even know about. I'm sure they're negotiating, but they give up at an earlier stage, letting Slovakia and Hungary take the brunt of being called bad boys, yes, of the alliance. But they wouldn't be happy. They're happy with this kind of uncertainty about the future. The future of continuing these sanctions, I would say. But that would be my response, is that the trend in NATO has been toward expansion. Expansion inevitably makes unity more difficult. That's just a logical, mathematical expectation. And given the likely outcome of the conflict in Ukraine, given the current trajectory of the United States, the security guarantees offered by NATO do not seem as convincing to me as they once were.
Right now in America, you have the hawkish advisors of Mr. Trump. I don't know whether Mr. Rubio would be regarded as a hawkish figure, though he was in the past. But certainly some people push Mr. Trump to continue the war. Others, such as J.D. Vance, such as Tulsi Gabbard, even Steve Bannon, seem to be more silent these days. What do you think will be the political outcome of Trump's agenda in terms of foreign policy in 2026? Will he be able, or will he be in a position to say, look, I brought you peace in the Middle East and also in Ukraine, or not so much?
The objective of American foreign policy is never peace. The objective of American foreign policy is the advancement of America's interests. If peace is one of those interests, then peace is fine. If war is one of those interests, or conflict, or tariffs, or harsh relations and exchange of diplomatic notes, that's fine too. It's very clear that the Trump administration takes seriously and very publicly makes a show of putting America's interests, as they define it, of course, America's interests first above those of any other nation. And your interests, the other nations, simply do not matter to us. They simply do not matter. It's our interests that you have to take into account. We are the superpower, you are not. That's the tone that is taken with enemy and friend alike by this administration. So the outcome of this debate, I think, will be determined by which camp can actually convince Trump and his closest advisors, whoever actually speaks to his heart, knows how to speak to his heart. Probably his family members, his wife, other people, not so much the people that he sort of brings in for consultancy. Historically, presidents have relied on close friends, family members, that sort of thing to really make a decisive commitment to one policy or another. And the issue will be, what is actually the more practical outcome for the United States, the more pragmatically beneficial? The pro-war camp argues that it's actually in America's best interests to continue the war. What's not to like? Look what we're accomplishing. We know American troops are dying, but we are in fact making a profit off of the sale of weapons because NATO, or the European NATO allies, are buying them to do our bidding, or to do essentially what they want to do, and we have no particular concern one way or another. But for Russia, it's an economic transaction from which the United States can, producers of weapons, and the United States economy. Now, the political benefit is to weaken Russia, to distract Russia, to keep it bogged down in Ukraine. What about Ukraine itself? Nobody cares about Ukraine. Let's be honest. That's just not a strategic, it's not significant enough strategically to be a major consideration in American foreign policy. Whereas profit, subordinating and making the Europeans dependent on American weaponry, which this does, and the whole American military system. And thirdly, weakening a potential rival in Russia, which also brings China to the table and distracts China. China, by the way, I think their foreign minister recently made that comment to the EU foreign minister that China does not want Russia to lose, because then the United States would focus entirely on China. So, so far, the reason the war is continuing is because it benefits most people involved, most of the major interests involved. Obviously, it does not benefit, does not benefit the Ukrainians, although whether or not it benefits certain constituencies in Ukraine is another issue again. Then there's the peace, let's say peace
party
platform, peace party. So their argument is we can make even more money if we heal our relations with Russia. Again, Russia is the focus, not Ukraine. And in order to ultimately get back on track and be able to pursue all of the profitable ventures that we want with Russia, we have to deal with this Ukrainian issue. Just get it resolved. ceasefire is fine. Whatever stops the, so that we can then say to the people, to our investors, we can lift sanctions, we can do all sorts of things. When the United States will be the first to break out of the sanctions that it itself asked to impose. The Europeans will have a difficult time. Yeah, they'll be the last ones and the most to suffer as a result. But the United States, I think, will do so, especially with the current administration. It will do so with alacrity, as soon as a convincing case can be made. So there is more profit to be gained there and more eventual stability, which is why the focus has been, I think, secondarily on the Ukrainian negotiation, and not really on negotiating a peace, but actually on negotiating only a ceasefire. A ceasefire is not a peace, as we know from previous ceasefires, including the 70-year ceasefire that we've had with North Korea, which is not actually with no peace settlement there. But it's good enough, and hopefully it can turn into something more stable. At that point, once this transition is made from a state of war, not many other opportunities, the peace platform would say, open up. And these are opportunities that the United States, the back of their keep in their back pocket is, it will be difficult for us to confront China, for the United States to confront China without at least Russia's acquiescence. If Russia and China are united, deep time maintaining its hegemony. So we need to break that alliance. And that is essentially the strongest argument of the peace platform, that we need to be concerned about China, and the way to do that is to break Russia free from the Chinese embrace.
And you're hoping to see probably J.D. Vance, Steve Bannon, perhaps even Tucker Carlson and others persuading Trump of the utility of this last position. Now, we've talked about pretty much everything, but we have not said a word about Volodymyr Zelensky, and your expertise is Ukraine. I read your book about Ukraine, which is very good and very impressive, and you made many powerful arguments about the need.
We're breaking up.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
So you said that.
Sorry. There. Yeah. I'm back.
You said that Ukraine needs to build a civic nation. You said that Ukraine needs to stop promoting this aggressive Galician nationalism. The question, though, is what will Ukraine do with Volodymyr Zelensky if he gets defeated?
Well,
because this seems to be the outcome.
Not all that different from the situation is probably not all that different from what we recall the post-power realities that face former dictators in communist times. What happens to them? Sometimes they are made the scapegoat of the things that didn't go right. That's always a possibility, particularly in Ukraine, particularly because Zelensky has very recently shown himself to be willing to take such measures, extreme measures, against his own domestic opponents, be they religious opponents, be they anti-corruption investigators, be they political or media personalities. Now,
like Alexei Arestovich, just to give an example.
Yes, just yes, and many others. And the situation, however, is mitigated by the fact that he, like many of his predecessors, including former prime ministers, both his prime minister, Poroshenko's prime minister, as well as the previous governments, can find refuge abroad. They can be welcomed in Britain, in America, to a nice pension.
Like the former president of Afghanistan. Sorry, just to confirm, like the former president of Afghanistan.
Also, yeah, there are many examples of this. When they don't do that, like former President Petro Poroshenko, there are many now in Ukraine who predict his arrest because he is becoming a little too vocal in his criticism, and criticism of the current government has very often been used to initiate criminal proceedings for treason. So we shall see where that goes. But there are a handful of voices that are somewhat critical of Zelensky, but he is trying to remove them. At some point, however, there will have to be elections. I don't know when or how. I don't really know whether he will do well in those elections or not. Historically, incumbents have done very badly, always in Ukraine. There's only been one president, Kuchma, elected to a second term. This president, whether you support him now or not, whether you think he's done a good job, there will be so much criticism of so many different aspects of his policy that it's hard to see him doing well. There's simply too many diverse constituencies who would say, no, that's why people don't, when they vote for a dream, but when they vote against, it only takes one thing that they don't like to cast a negative vote. So I think the most likely scenario is that he will leave the country for some sort of, or maybe be appointed an ambassador or something, but overseas, where he can be at a safe distance from Ukrainian politics and safe both for Ukrainian policymakers and for himself and his family.
Now, because we are almost past midnight here in Bucharest,
sorry to keep you up.
We should it's a great pleasure to talk to you and to listen to you and to learn from you. And I would actually recommend all your books to our listeners. But before we exit this show, I should like to ask you a last question related to the Orthodox Church, because Zelensky in 2019, I believe, he went to the Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, if I'm not mistaken, Onufri. Is that right?
Yes.
And he even promised that he would convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, which of course never happened.
I don't know about that.
It's a gossip. It's a gossip.
Seems unlikely.
It's a religious gossip. I mean, politicians always make promises. Now the question is, how do you see the future of such important religious figures who are also persecuted in Ukraine? And what do you think will be the outcome of these two churches, which are basically right now caught in the war between Russia and Ukraine?
Right. Well, there are two or more, but the main two rival Eastern Orthodox churches: the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine under Metropolitan Dumienka.
The autocephalous one?
No, this is one that was created through the tomos given by the Patriarch of Constantinople at the request of President Petro Poroshenko. And it was that entire incident was part of Petro Poroshenko's electoral campaign to make sure that he would have a secure base in Western Ukraine. But oddly enough, there's a third group, which is the Uniates or Greek Catholics who, in Western Ukraine, who are nominally Catholic but observe the Eastern Rite, the Orthodox Rite. So those three are rivals. And the largest, as you pointed out, has historically been, with the largest number of monasteries, priests, and communicants, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, headed by Metropolitan Onufry, who has whose Ukrainian citizenship has recently been removed because it has been alleged that he simultaneously holds a Russian passport, although he says that Russian passport was simply from an earlier that he had any Ukrainians simply retain their old passports without necessarily canceling, as has only recently been required by Ukrainian law. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, if you look at the history of the church, I believe it was the great historian Tertullian who said the tree of the church is watered by the blood of martyrs. So it seems to me that the more that the current leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is transformed by the actions of the Ukrainian government into martyrs, most importantly in the eyes of the Ukrainian people, and secondarily in the eyes of the international community, the stronger it gets, ultimately. Yes, their churches can be burned down, they can be seized, priests and even bishops can be attacked, but in the long run, we expect a resurrection from death. So we expect more than anything, the bride of Christ, the church, to be resurrected and to triumph in the long run. And we're not looking to do this under the political here. Only we have confidence as Orthodox in the truth of the greater message of salvation, and I would add of forgiveness. And I think it would be a very good thing for Ukrainians as a society to worry less about the the ostensible political affiliations of this religious community or that religious community, but to hear in their hearts the message of these religious Christian communities, which is or should be and usually is one of forgiveness and compassion. And if we had that sort of society, and to our enemies, as we are called to do, to forgive our enemies and to embrace them, then I think all these troubles, including this war, would be so much closer to ending.
Well, on that very positive and theological and deeply spiritual note, we should end our conversation here. And I hope that we can get back to this conversation a few months from now, and perhaps we'll be in a position to rejoice and celebrate the moment of forgiveness and the moment of reconstruction for Ukraine.
Let's hope so. Yes.
Thank you, Nikolai, and have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.